I never thought my life would unravel like this. If you had asked me a year ago, I would have said my marriage to Lena was solid. Sure, we had our disagreements. What couple doesn't? But we were partners. Or at least, I thought we were. Lena worked as a marketing consultant, and her job required her to travel all over the city for meetings. Public transport stressed her out, and she hated driving in traffic, so she started using rideshare services. It seemed harmless enough at first, a practical solution to her work-related commutes. She mentioned the driver in passing a few times. His name was Tom. He's reliable, she said once over dinner. Knows all the shortcuts. It's nice not to worry about being late for meetings. I was glad she found someone dependable. My own work days were long, and the last thing I wanted was to stress about her running around the city. Besides, she never gave me a reason to worry. Lena was confident, opinionated, and independent, qualities I had admired when we first met. Looking back, there were subtle signs that things were shifting. She started talking about Tom more often. At first, it was casual. Stories about how he got her to a meeting just in time or how they laughed over some absurd traffic incident. But then her anecdotes grew more personal. She mentioned that he was funny, a good listener, and always seemed to know when she needed cheering up. I didn't think much of it. After all, it was just a driver. A stranger really. Why would she care about him beyond the convenience of his service? But the rides became more frequent. She started booking him even for non-work errands, claiming he was the only one who actually knows where I like to go. It was odd, sure, but I didn't want to seem possessive. Let her have her quirks, I told myself. Now I see how blind I was. The changes in Lena were subtle at first. She'd come home later than usual, brushing it off with excuses about last-minute meetings or running into an old friend. Sometimes she seemed distracted during dinner, her eyes flicking to her phone every time it buzzed. I asked her about it once, casually. You seem preoccupied lately. Everything okay? She scoffed, waving me off. Work's just been hectic, that's all. Relax, you're overthinking. And maybe I was, but the air between us started to shift. She wasn't as affectionate anymore. She didn't ask about my day as much or share the little details of hers like she used to. Conversations that once flowed easily now felt forced, like we were strangers trying to make small talk. Then there were the errands. Lena suddenly seemed to have an endless list of them. I'll be back in an hour, she'd say, grabbing her purse and phone. An hour would turn into 3, sometimes 4. One Saturday, I decided to surprise her by offering to drive her instead of her usual rideshare. She froze for a moment, her expression hard to read, before quickly shaking her head. No, it's fine. Tom's already on his way, she said, almost too quickly. I laughed it off. You talk about this Tom guy like he's your personal chauffeur. She smirked, but there was something icy about it. Well, he's good at his job. Unlike some people, he doesn't complain about traffic. I let the jab slide. Lena had a sharp tongue, and I'd learned long ago to pick my battles. But her growing attachment to this stranger started to gnaw at me. One evening, I noticed her lingering outside the house after one of her errands. I peeked out the window and saw her leaning against the passenger door of a black car, laughing at something the driver said. She touched her hair, a habit of hers when she was nervous or flirting. When she finally came inside, I asked her how her day went. Fine, she said with a shrug, avoiding my eyes. Was that Tom out there? I pressed, keeping my tone light. Her eyes narrowed. What's with the interrogation? He's just my driver, for God's sake. Don't make it weird. I laughed it off again, but the seed of doubt was planted. Weeks passed, and the unease in my gut grew stronger. Lena's absences became more frequent, and her mood swings more volatile. One minute she was affectionate, almost apologetic, and the next, she was snapping at me over the smallest things. Do you always have to leave your shoes by the door? She'd bark, her tone sharp enough to cut. They've been there for years, I'd reply, baffled. Well, it's annoying now, she'd hiss, storming off before I could respond. Her phone became another battleground. She was glued to it, even during meals. When I'd glance over, she'd angle the screen away or quickly lock it. Once I caught her typing furiously and asked who she was texting. Work, she said without missing a beat. You know, the thing that pays our bills? It was a low blow, and I bit my tongue to avoid escalating things. But the final straw came on a quiet Sunday afternoon. I'd been cleaning out the garage when I found one of her scarves in a box of old winter clothes. It struck me as odd because I'd seen her wearing that same scarf just a week earlier. Curious, I checked the closet. Sure enough, the scarf was missing from its usual spot. When I asked her about it later, her response was evasive. "I must have two of them," she said with a dismissive wave, not even looking up from her phone. Her lies were piling up, but I still didn't want to believe the worst. I told myself I was imagining things, that this was just a rough patch every marriage goes through. But deep down, I knew better. My suspicions reached a boiling point one Thursday evening. Lena had left earlier that afternoon, claiming she was meeting a colleague to discuss a new project. I was supposed to be working late, but a canceled meeting brought me home early. As I pulled into our street, I noticed a black car parked a few houses down. Something about it seemed familiar. Then I saw her, Lena. She was leaning against the car door, laughing with the driver. It was Tom. I sat in my car, watching from a distance. My heart pounded as she reached out to touch his arm, her laugh ringing out like it was the happiest sound in the world. A laugh I hadn't heard in months. They stood there for a while, chatting like old friends. But the way she looked at him, the way she tilted her head, the way she fiddled with her necklace, was more than friendly. It was intimate. When she finally walked away and headed toward the house, I slid out of my car and quietly followed. "Back early," I said as she stepped inside. Her face froze for a split second before breaking into a forced smile. "Yeah, the meeting wrapped up quicker than I expected." "Funny," I said, keeping my tone even. "I thought you were still out with your colleague." Her eyes darted to the side. "I was. We grabbed coffee after." "What's with the third degree?" I shrugged, feigning indifference. "Just curious. You seem to be having a good time with Tom." Her expression darkened instantly. "Oh, for God's sake. Are you seriously spying on me now? He's just my driver." I held her gaze, trying to gauge if she'd crack under the pressure. But Lena was good, too good. "Maybe stop obsessing over my every move," she snapped, storming off to the bedroom. I stood there in the silence of the living room, anger and confusion swirling in my chest. I wasn't sure what was worse, her lies or the fact that I couldn't prove she was lying. But I was determined to find out. After that evening, I knew I had to stop relying on Lena's word. Her evasiveness, her sudden hostility, it all pointed to something deeper, something she wasn't willing to admit. I decided to dig. The first thing I did was check her rideshare account. I'd never bothered before. I didn't think I had a reason to. But now I wanted to see just how often she was booking Tom. I waited until she was in the shower and opened her laptop. She was logged in. The rides were frequent, almost daily, and almost all were with him. But what struck me most were the destinations. Many of them weren't to her usual work locations. There were coffee shops, random parking lots, and even places on the outskirts of town. It didn't add up. I took screenshots of the most suspicious trips, my heart pounding with every click. I felt like a spy in my own home, and it sickened me. But I needed evidence. A few days later, I decided to confront her. Not directly, but subtly. "Hey," I said one morning as we had breakfast. "I was thinking maybe we should take a weekend trip. Just the two of us. It's been a while since we spent time together." Her reaction was exactly what I feared. "A weekend trip? Now," she said, barely looking up from her phone. "I can't. Work's crazy right now. Maybe later." "Work's always crazy," I replied gently. "That's why we need a break." She sighed dramatically, setting her phone down. "Can we not do this right now? I've got enough on my plate without you adding to it." I let it go, but the bitterness lingered. I needed more than suspicions. I needed undeniable proof. That's when I decided to follow her. The decision to follow Lena wasn't one I made lightly. It felt wrong, invasive, but I couldn't ignore the growing weight of doubt pressing on my chest. If I was wrong, I'd owe her an apology. If I was right, well, I wasn't sure what I'd do then. She left the house at 4:30 p.m. on a Friday, claiming she had an evening meeting. I watched from the window as she climbed into a familiar black car. Tom's car. I waited a few minutes before grabbing my keys and heading out. Keeping a safe distance, I tailed them through the city. My heart was racing, adrenaline surging as I tried not to lose them in traffic. They didn't go to an office building or a coffee shop. Instead, Tom drove to a small, secluded park on the outskirts of town. He pulled into a dirt lot surrounded by trees, far from prying eyes. I parked my car at a distance and waited, watching as they both got out. Lena was laughing, her face lighting up in a way I hadn't seen in months. Tom reached out to brush a strand of hair from her face, and she didn't pull away. I clenched the steering wheel, anger and betrayal coursing through me. But I stayed quiet, hidden in the shadows, watching as they walked toward a bench under a large oak tree. They sat close, their conversation animated. I couldn't hear what they were saying, but the way she leaned into him, the way her hand rested on his knee, it was all I needed to see. I wanted to confront her right then and there, but I held back. I needed to think, to process what I just witnessed. As they walked back to the car, I snapped a few pictures with my phone. Evidence. Proof. When I got home, I poured myself a drink and waited for Lena to return. She walked in hours later, her cheeks flushed, her excuse ready. "Long meeting," she said, kicking off her shoes. "I'm exhausted." I didn't respond. I just stared at her, my mind racing with questions and the weight of what I'd just uncovered. The silence between us that evening was deafening. Lena noticed, of course, but she didn't say anything. Instead, she busied herself with her phone and acted like nothing was out of the ordinary. I couldn't take it anymore. "Did your meeting go well?" I asked, my tone sharper than intended. She glanced up, her expression briefly startled before settling into one of irritation. "Yeah, I told you it was fine. Where was it again?" I pressed, leaning back in my chair. Her eyes narrowed slightly. "Why are you asking? I already said it was work." "I'm just curious," I replied, keeping my voice even. "It's funny, though. Your meeting seemed to happen in a park today." Her face froze. For the briefest moment, I saw a panic flash in her eyes before she quickly masked it with annoyance. "What are you talking about?" she snapped, crossing her arms. "I followed you," I said, my voice steady despite the storm brewing inside me. "I saw you with Tom." She stared at me, her mouth opening and closing as she scrambled for a response. "You followed me?" She finally spat, her voice rising. "What the hell is wrong with you? Are you some kind of stalker now?" "Don't turn this on me, Lena," I said, my temper flaring. "You lied. You said you were at a meeting, but you were with him, laughing, touching, God knows what else." "You're insane," she hissed, her face twisting with anger. "Do you hear yourself? You're acting paranoid. Tom is just a friend, someone I can actually talk to without being judged." "A friend?" I said, letting out a bitter laugh. "Do friends lie about where they're going? Do they hold hands in parks?" "You don't get it," she shot back, her voice trembling. "You've been so distant, so cold. Tom listens to me. He makes me feel appreciated, unlike you." Her words hit like a slap. But instead of guilt, I felt a surge of anger. "Appreciated?" I echoed. "Is that what you call sneaking around behind my back? Lying every chance you get?" She threw her hands in the air, her voice climbing to a near scream. "Oh, grow up. Not everything is about you. Maybe if you paid more attention, I wouldn't have to find comfort elsewhere." That was it. The truth was out, twisted and ugly, but undeniable. I stared at her, the woman I thought I knew, and felt something break inside me. "This marriage is over," I said, my voice cold and final. Her eyes widened, but instead of sadness, I saw fury. "You're pathetic," she hissed. "Fine. Go ahead and leave. See if I care." I walked away, her voice following me down the hall, hurling insults and accusations. But I didn't stop. I couldn't. I needed to be free of her lies. The days that followed were a blur. I moved out of our bedroom that night, staying in the guest room as if somehow the physical distance could ease the emotional pain. Lena didn't seem to care much. She spent her time locked away in the other room, texting furiously on her phone, likely to Tom or some other poor soul. I called a lawyer the next morning. The word divorce left my mouth like venom, but I knew it was the only way forward. It wasn't just the betrayal. It was everything. The lies, the emotional neglect, the way she seemed to have slipped into a life without me in it. I couldn't live with someone who had no respect for me. Lena, on the other hand, didn't seem to process the situation at all. She stormed around the house, yelling that she didn't need my approval, that I was the one who didn't understand her. Yet, I saw her eyes dart to the phone again and again, as if waiting for Tom's next message. It was clear where her priorities lay. I spent hours, maybe even days, trying to figure out how things had gone so wrong. How did I miss it? Was I so blind to her subtle manipulations, to the emotional distance she'd built between us? I couldn't stop replaying those moments in the park. The laughter, the touch, the looks that passed between them. Every time it felt like a punch in the gut. One night, after I'd made my decision, I packed up the few things I'd brought into the marriage. My clothes, a few books, some personal items. I left behind the memories, the hopes, the dreams I'd once shared with Lena. She didn't even notice when I slipped out. The next day, I moved into an apartment downtown. I wanted to escape everything that reminded me of her. The house we'd bought together, the life we'd built. But it wasn't just the space that felt foreign. It was the feeling of emptiness that clung to me, like a shadow that refused to leave. Lena didn't try to contact me. Not immediately, at least. The divorce papers came within a week. She'd signed them without hesitation, her signature bold and final. No apology, no remorse. I was left to pick up the pieces of my broken heart. The weeks after I moved out were some of the hardest of my life. I'd never expected it to hit me this hard. The pain of seeing everything I'd worked for crumble. Every room I walked into in my new apartment felt empty cold. I spent most nights alone, replaying the past, asking myself how I could have been so blind. Lena's silence after the divorce papers was deafening. There were no late-night texts or desperate phone calls asking for another chance. She had moved on quickly, or so it seemed. The worst part wasn't that she was with someone else. It was how easily she seemed to let go of everything we had. One evening, about a month after we signed the papers, I received an unexpected text. It was from Lena. "Can we talk?" I stared at the screen, unsure of how to respond. Every fiber of my being told me not to engage, but curiosity gnawed at me. Maybe there was something she wanted to confess, some shred of guilt she'd been hiding all this time. I agreed to meet her at a coffee shop, despite the warning bells going off in my head. When I arrived, Lena was already sitting at a table, sipping her drink. She looked different, calmer, even a bit more put together than I remembered. It was almost as if she was meeting with an old friend, not her estranged husband. She looked up when I approached, offering me a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Thanks for meeting me," she said, her tone oddly calm. I sat down across from her, crossing my arms. "What do you want, Lena?" She hesitated before speaking. I don't know. I guess I wanted to apologize. I was wrong, and I know I hurt you. But you need to understand something." I raised an eyebrow. "Understand what?" Her eyes darted around the room before settling back on me. "I never loved you the way I should have. I was too selfish, too caught up in my own life to see how much you cared. Tom, he made me realize that." I felt a cold, bitter laugh rise in my throat. "So, this is about Tom now? You're telling me all this because of him?" She looked at me, her face twisting with something close to regret. "I didn't want it to happen like this. But I've realized that we were never meant to be, that I was living in a fantasy. I can't change what happened, but I think we both deserve to move on." Her words were like a slap in the face, and I couldn't hold back the anger that bubbled to the surface. "You think I should just move on? After everything? After the lies? After the way you treated me?" Lena winced but didn't back down. "I'm sorry, but you need to understand that I didn't know how to fix things. I wasn't happy, and I didn't know how to tell you." I stood up abruptly, pushing the chair back. "Don't. Just don't. You don't get to act like you're the victim here, Lena. You made your choice. Now, you can live with it." Her face hardened. "Maybe I can. Maybe I've been happier without you. But you don't get to act like I'm the only one at fault." I turned and walked away, feeling the weight of the finality settle in my chest. I didn't care about her excuses or her apologies. It was clear that she had moved on, and no amount of words would change that. As I walked out of the coffee shop, I realized something. I had been holding on to the past for so long, and now I had to let it go. It's strange how quickly life can change when you finally accept the truth. After that meeting with Lena, something inside me shifted. I'd been carrying around so much resentment, so much hurt, that I couldn't even remember what it felt like to breathe freely. But as I walked out of that coffee shop, I realized it wasn't about her anymore. It was about me, about moving forward, even if the path wasn't clear yet. I threw myself into work, filling the emptiness with long hours and the dull hum of routine. It was easier to be numb than to think about the hole Lena had left behind. She had been my life for so long, and now I had to rebuild from scratch. I started picking up old hobbies, things I put aside for her, painting, hiking, reading books I'd forgotten I loved. For the first time in a while, I began to feel a sense of peace that had nothing to do with her or anyone else. I was reclaiming myself. It wasn't all smooth sailing. There were days when I'd wake up and still feel that ache in my chest, the remnants of what Lena and I had. I missed the companionship, the laughter we once shared, the hope that we could work things out. But then I'd remember the way she had treated me, the lies, and the betrayal. That anger, though painful, was also a shield. I started dating again a few months later. Nothing serious at first, just casual dates, meeting new people. It felt strange at first, but also freeing. It was a reminder that I wasn't tied to the past, that there were still possibilities in my future. And then one evening, about a year after Lena and I had separated, I ran into her at a mutual friend's party. She looked different, more put together, more confident. She was laughing, chatting with a group of people, and for a brief moment, I almost felt that old pull toward her. But as I stood there, watching her from across the room, something became clear to me. She wasn't the person I had fallen in love with anymore. She had become someone else, someone who no longer fit into my life. She saw me eventually, and for a moment, we just stood there, staring at each other. Her eyes softened, and I saw a flicker of something. Regret, maybe. But I wasn't interested in her apologies anymore. I nodded, acknowledging her presence, and then I turned away. I had moved on. The decision to turn my back on Lena wasn't as easy as I made it look. It would be a lie to say that seeing her that night didn't stir up old feelings. Her presence was a haunting reminder of what we once had. The way she looked, the familiar cadence of her laugh, the way she smiled. It all triggered the memories I had so carefully packed away. For a split second, I almost convinced myself that there was still something to salvage. But as the evening wore on, something else took over. The realization that I had changed, that I had grown beyond the man who was once so consumed by her, began to sink in. The weight of the past was there, lurking just below the surface, but it didn't have the power to control me anymore. It was my freedom that felt more powerful, and that's when I realized that I didn't need her approval, her love, or even her presence to be whole. I had been living in a state of constant conflict for so long, torn between wanting to save what we had and knowing deep down that I had to walk away. That night, I found the clarity I had been searching for. It wasn't just about letting go of Lena. It was about letting go of the version of myself I had been when I was with her. The person who was willing to ignore the warning signs, to look past the lies, the emotional neglect, and the affairs. Lena had been my world for so long that I had forgotten how to live without her in it. And in those quiet moments when I would lie awake at night, thinking about our marriage, I couldn't understand why I had allowed myself to sink so deeply into the relationship, ignoring all the signs of her betrayal. I thought about the way she would twist the truth, how she would belittle me when I asked the smallest of questions, and how she would brush off my concerns with the cold indifference of someone who no longer cared. It took me months to process all of it, to fully comprehend the extent of the emotional manipulation that had taken place. Lena had made me doubt myself, question my worth, and believe that I wasn't enough. But in the aftermath of the divorce, I realized that it wasn't me who was broken. It was her, a person who, deep down, had never truly valued the love and commitment I had given her. One of the hardest things I had to come to terms with was the fact that the Lena I had loved was no longer the person standing in front of me. She had changed. Her actions had irrevocably altered her in ways I couldn't fix. And in that moment, I realized I didn't want to fix her anymore. I didn't want to be the person she used to manipulate or take advantage of. The days that followed that encounter with Lena were filled with self-reflection and quiet moments of clarity. I realized that my path forward was one of healing, of finding myself again in a world without her. I needed to reclaim the parts of myself I had given away so willingly in the name of love. I needed to rediscover the man I used to be before I met Lena, the man who was whole on his own, who didn't rely on anyone else to define his happiness. But the road to healing wasn't a straight one. It was filled with setbacks, moments of doubt, and waves of grief. It was hard to admit that I had wasted so much time in a relationship that never truly nourished me. But there were also moments of growth, of learning how to stand up for myself, of reclaiming the strength I had forgotten I had. I started seeking therapy. It wasn't something I had ever considered before, but as I sat across from a stranger who listened without judgment, I realized how much I needed to unpack. The pain, the confusion, the betrayal. It was all still there, lurking beneath the surface. But with each session, I started to understand more about myself and the unhealthy dynamics that had played out in my marriage. Therapy became my safe space, a place where I could confront the darkest parts of myself, the parts that still clung to the hope that things could be different. It was there that I realized that my desire for closure wasn't about getting an apology from Lena. It was about forgiving myself. For years, I had blamed myself for the failure of our marriage, thinking that I could have done more, been better, or somehow prevented her infidelity. But as I talked through everything in therapy, I began to see that I wasn't the one who had failed. Lena had made her choices, and I had been left to pick up the pieces. But I didn't have to keep carrying the burden of those pieces forever. The next step in my healing process was reclaiming my independence. I started spending more time with friends, going out for drinks, catching up with old acquaintances, and doing things I hadn't done in years. It felt good to feel like myself again. I wasn't just some husband who had been wronged. I was an individual, a person with passions, interests, and desires outside of a relationship. I also focused on my physical health. I began running every morning, something I had neglected in recent years. The rhythm of my feet pounding against the pavement became a form of therapy, each step symbolizing progress. Each breath of air filling my lungs a reminder that I was alive and capable of moving forward. As the months passed, I found that my life slowly began to take shape again. I wasn't completely healed, and I wasn't sure I ever would be. But I was learning how to live without the weight of Lena's betrayal hanging over me. I was learning how to forgive, not just her, but myself. As the weeks continued to pass, I found myself settling into a new rhythm. My days had a new purpose, and I could finally see the horizon without the weight of Lena's memory constantly clouding my vision. It wasn't that I had completely forgotten her, but I was starting to learn how to live without needing her in my life. I realized I didn't need her validation anymore. I didn't need anyone to define me. The therapy sessions had become less frequent, but the work didn't stop. I was slowly starting to understand the deep scars that had been left behind by my marriage. The emotional manipulation, the constant dismissal, the loneliness I had felt despite being physically present with someone for years, it all began to make sense. I had been so caught up in trying to save something that was never meant to be saved that I had neglected my own needs. One night, after a long day at work, I found myself sitting at a bar, nursing a glass of whiskey. I was by myself, not out of loneliness, but because I enjoyed the quiet solitude. It was peaceful, something I hadn't experienced in a long time. I wasn't looking for anything that evening. But then she walked in. She was sitting a few stools down from me, casually scrolling through her phone, her back turned to me. But I could tell something was different about her. There was an air of confidence, a kind of independence that I didn't see before. Her features were familiar, but there was a maturity to her now, a self-assurance that stood out. It was like looking at someone who had been through something and come out on the other side. I was drawn to her for reasons I didn't fully understand. Maybe it was the way she held herself. Maybe it was the quiet strength she exuded. Or maybe it was just the feeling of being drawn to someone new, someone who wasn't part of my past. For a moment, I debated whether or not I should approach her. The old me would have been hesitant, self-conscious, unsure of how to make the first move. But the man I had become in the wake of my divorce was different. He was no longer afraid to take chances, to put himself out there. I stood up and walked over to her. "Is this seat taken?" I asked, my voice steady, even though my heart was pounding in my chest. She looked up, a slight smile forming on her lips as she glanced at the empty stool. "No, not at all," she replied, her voice warm. "Feel free." I took a seat next to her, and we exchanged pleasantries, talking about the usual things: work, the weather, and, of course, the city. There was an ease to the conversation, an unspoken connection that felt refreshing. She wasn't like Lena. She wasn't trying to impress me, and she wasn't hiding anything. She was just herself, and I found that comforting. We ended up talking for hours, laughing over small anecdotes, sharing stories about our lives. Her name was Mia. She worked in marketing and had recently moved to the city for a new job. Her energy was infectious, and her presence was magnetic. There was no pressure, no expectations, just two people getting to know each other in the most casual way. When we said our goodbyes that night, I didn't expect anything more than a polite exchange. But as I walked to my car, something stirred in me, a feeling I hadn't experienced in years: excitement. Not for the future, but for the present moment. The next few days went by, and I couldn't shake the memory of Mia. There was something real about her, something raw and genuine. It felt good to meet someone who wasn't tied to the past, someone who was simply her own person. I hadn't felt this way in so long. I decided to reach out to her. I wasn't looking for a rebound or a distraction from the pain of my past. I simply wanted to see if there was something more to explore. I sent her a text. "Had a great time talking the other night. Would love to do it again sometime." She replied almost immediately, "I'd like that too. When are you free?" It was the beginning of something new. It wasn't a whirlwind romance, but it didn't have to be. I wasn't ready for anything too fast, but I was ready for something genuine. And Mia, in her own quiet way, was exactly that. As we started seeing each other more regularly, I began to notice how different she was from Lena. Mia didn't have the need to manipulate or control. She didn't twist words or deflect responsibility. What you saw with her was what you got: someone kind, someone real, and someone who valued honesty above everything else. It was a slow burn, a steady progression of getting to know each other. But for the first time since my marriage ended, I found myself feeling something I hadn't felt in years: hope. The kind of hope that didn't come from the possibility of someone changing for the better, but from the understanding that I didn't need to wait for someone to change. Mia was already who she needed to be. I didn't know where things would go with Mia. But for the first time in a long time, I didn't feel like I was rushing toward something, nor did I feel like I was hiding from my past. I was simply allowing myself to enjoy the present, something I hadn't allowed myself to do in years. For the first time, I realized that healing wasn't about forgetting Lena, or even about completely erasing her from my heart. Healing was about recognizing that I was worth more than the hurt I had experienced, that I deserved to find joy again, even if it meant taking things slow. As the weeks passed, I found myself settling into a comfortable routine with Mia. It wasn't something I had anticipated, but it was something I had needed. The more time we spent together, the more I realized just how different she was from Lena, and not just in the obvious ways. It wasn't just her openness, her willingness to speak her mind, or her ability to laugh at the small things. It was the way she treated me. She didn't view me as someone she could control or manipulate, and she certainly didn't view me as her emotional punching bag. Every conversation with Mia felt like a breath of fresh air. There was no need to walk on eggshells, no need to second-guess her intentions. She was genuine, and for the first time in a long time, I felt like I could truly be myself around her. I didn't have to pretend to be something I wasn't just to keep the peace. I didn't have to filter my thoughts or hide my emotions. With Mia, I could just exist. We spent weekends together exploring the city, going to new restaurants, and even just hanging out in parks or museums. There was no pressure to be anything other than ourselves. It was the kind of relationship I had always dreamed of having, one based on mutual respect, trust, and understanding. Still, even as I embraced this new chapter of my life, there were times when the past would resurface. There were moments like when I would catch myself slipping into old patterns of doubt, or when I would start comparing Mia to Lena, that I had to remind myself just how far I had come. I wasn't the same person I had been when I was with Lena, and I wasn't about to let my past dictate my future. I had learned to be cautious, but not in a way that shut me off from the world. I was cautious because I had learned the hard way that people could deceive you, and that love didn't always come with the security it promised. But I also knew that I couldn't let the fear of being hurt again prevent me from experiencing something real with Mia. One evening, after a quiet dinner at her place, I found myself sitting on the couch, my hand resting gently on hers. We had just been talking about our respective childhoods, and the conversation had taken a surprisingly deep turn. It wasn't like the conversations Lena and I used to have, where everything felt surface level and where I could never truly be open without fear of judgment. "I've been thinking a lot," I said, my voice soft, breaking the comfortable silence, "about how different things are now, how different I feel, how much I've changed since we first met." Mia turned her head to look at me, her expression warm. "In what way?" I hesitated, not quite sure how to express everything I was feeling. I had never been great at opening up emotionally, not like this, but for some reason, it felt easier with Mia. "I guess I feel like I'm finally healing, like I'm not the same person I was when I was with Lena. I spent so many years in that relationship thinking I had to prove my worth to her. But now, I realize that I don't need to prove anything to anyone. Not to you, not to her, not to anyone. I'm enough as I am." Mia smiled softly, her fingers gently brushing against mine. "You are enough. You've always been enough." I smiled back, a sense of peace settling over me. It wasn't just the reassurance in her words. It was the way she said them, with sincerity, with certainty. For once, I didn't feel like I had to explain myself. I didn't feel like I had to earn her love or her respect. It was already there in the way she listened to me, in the way she showed up for me, and in the way she cared for me. "I don't know if I'm ready for something serious," I admitted, my voice hesitant but not fearful. "But I want to keep seeing where this goes. I don't want to rush it. I want to take my time and see if this is real." Mia's expression softened, and she leaned in slightly, her voice gentle but sure. "I'm in no rush either. I'm just happy to be with you, and I'm excited to see where this goes too." That was the moment when I truly realized that I had found something different. It wasn't about chasing an ideal or running away from the past. It was about allowing myself to simply be, to be loved, to love in return. The following months were filled with more of the same quiet exploration. We kept getting to know each other, taking things one step at a time, not rushing to fit our lives into some preconceived mold. We didn't try to force anything. There was no pressure. It was a refreshing change from everything I had experienced in my marriage. And then, one day, we were sitting on a bench in a small park by the river, watching the sun dip below the horizon. The light cast a warm glow over Mia's face, and I found myself just staring at her, taking it all in. "This feels right," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know how else to put it, but this feels right." She smiled at me, a soft, contented smile that made my heart ache with a kind of joy I had never known before. "I'm glad you feel that way." "I do too." It wasn't some grand, dramatic moment. There were no fireworks or sudden declarations. It was simply a quiet, shared understanding between us. The understanding that we didn't need to rush or force anything. What we had was real, and it was enough. And for the first time in a long time, I wasn't afraid of what the future might hold. I wasn't afraid to love again, because with Mia, I knew that I could. As the months passed, my life with Mia became more and more settled. I had started to find a kind of peace in the slow, steady pace of our relationship. It wasn't about rushing to the next stage or chasing an ideal future. It was about enjoying what we had in the here and now. And that, in itself, felt like a revelation. I hadn't realized how much I had been missing out on in my past relationships. The quiet moments, the simple pleasures, the ease of just being. But no matter how much I tried to move forward, the past still had a way of creeping up on me. It was as if it was always lurking in the background, just beneath the surface of everything I did. Sometimes, a certain memory of Lena would flash in my mind. The sound of her laugh, her cold gaze when she didn't care, the way she would pull away from me when I needed her most. Other times, it was the fleeting pang of guilt, the feeling that I was betraying my past by moving forward with Mia. I didn't want to carry that baggage with me into my new life, but sometimes it was hard not to. The memories of Lena were so deeply ingrained in me, like an old wound that had never quite healed. And even though Mia had been nothing but kind and understanding, I found myself holding back at times, not allowing myself to fully open up. It wasn't until one evening, several months into my relationship with Mia, that the weight of my past came crashing down on me. It was a quiet evening, a simple dinner at Mia's apartment. The conversation had been light, easy, but as we sat together on the couch afterward, a topic came up that I hadn't been prepared for. "I've been meaning to ask you something," Mia said, her voice soft but curious. I looked up from my phone, unsure of where this was headed. "What is it?" She hesitated, a faint smile playing on her lips. "Do you ever think about your ex? About Lena?" I felt my chest tighten at the mention of her name. I had managed to avoid thinking about Lena for the most part, but hearing her name now stirred up old emotions. I didn't know how to respond, unsure of how much to share. "I do," I admitted after a moment, my voice quieter than I intended. "Sometimes. Not as often as I used to, but yet there are moments when it hits me. The memories, the regret." Mia nodded, her expression understanding. "I get that. We all have a past. But I want you to know that you don't have to carry that with you. I'm not her. I don't need you to prove anything to me. You're not her either. You're you." I felt a wave of emotion surge within me, a mixture of gratitude and pain. I realized just how much I had been holding on to and how much I had yet to let go of. Lena's betrayal had been a massive blow, and for so long, I had been consumed by it. I had been trying to prove to myself that I was worth something, even if Lena never saw it. But Mia's words hit me in a way I didn't expect. She wasn't asking me to forget the past. She was simply giving me permission to leave it behind, to step into something new without the constant shadow of my previous mistakes. "I don't want to keep letting the past define me," I said, my voice thick with emotion. "But sometimes it feels impossible to let go of everything." "You don't have to do it all at once," Mia said, squeezing my hand. "Just take it one day at a time, and know that I'm here with you, no matter what." For the first time in a long time, I felt like I had permission to heal. I didn't have to rush it. I didn't have to hide from it. I could face it piece by piece when I was ready. And the best part was that Mia wasn't asking me to be perfect. She wasn't demanding that I get over my past or erase the hurt that still lingered. She was simply offering me space to grow, to move at my own pace. That night, after we said our goodbyes and I left her apartment, I took a long walk through the city. I let my mind wander, thinking back to everything I had been through, the pain of discovering Lena's betrayal, the heartache of watching everything crumble, the process of rebuilding my life from the ashes. It had been a long, difficult journey, but it had also been one of self-discovery. I had learned things about myself that I never would have understood if I hadn't gone through the darkness. I had learned that I was stronger than I thought, that I didn't need to rely on anyone else to validate my worth. I had learned that it was okay to take time for myself, to be vulnerable with the right people, and to forgive not just others, but myself. When I returned to my apartment that night, I felt a strange sense of peace. For the first time in a long time, I didn't feel like I was constantly running away from the past. I didn't feel like I had to bury my feelings or pretend to be someone I wasn't. I had confronted the shadows, and while they were still there, they didn't have the power to control me anymore. I was finally starting to feel whole again. I was starting to feel like I could move forward without fear of what might come. And that was the most freeing feeling of all. As the months passed, I found myself standing at the edge of something new. My life had slowly shifted, the weight of the past becoming lighter with each passing day. Mia and I had built something solid, a foundation of trust and understanding. I had learned the hard way what it meant to be fully myself, without hiding or pretending. Mia and I continued to enjoy our time together, but I was no longer running from my past. I had faced it, confronted the hurt, the betrayal, and had given myself the grace to heal. I had learned that it was okay to let go, to forgive not just Lena, but myself for the mistakes I had made in the past. I didn't need to carry that weight anymore. That evening, as I sat with Mia, I realized how much I had changed. We weren't in a rush to define what we had, but I no longer feared what the future might bring. For the first time in years, I felt like I could breathe again, really breathe, without the suffocating pressure of regret or uncertainty. Mia, in her quiet way, had been there for me in a way I never expected. She didn't ask for perfection. She didn't demand anything more than my truth. And that was exactly what I needed. As we sat in her living room that night, I felt at peace. I looked over at her, her soft smile lighting up the room. We didn't need to speak much to understand that what we had was special, that it was built on a foundation of respect and genuine care. I don't think I could have gotten here without you, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. Mia turned toward me, her eyes warm and steady. You don't need to thank me. You're the one who did all the work. You're the one who chose to heal, to move forward. I just get to be a part of the journey. I felt the weight in my chest loosen. There was no need to explain, to seek validation, or to try to justify my worth. It was enough. I was enough. And for the first time in a long time, I didn't feel like I was trying to fix something broken. I wasn't chasing after a version of myself that no longer existed. I had embraced the man I had become. I was no longer the man defined by betrayal, by hurt, or by fear. I had stepped into a new chapter, one that was mine to shape, free from the past. The next few weeks passed in a quiet blur, with moments that felt simple yet significant. Mia and I spent more time together, enjoying the small joys that life had to offer. We didn't talk about our future in any grandiose terms. We just lived in the present, appreciating each moment for what it was. I realized that I didn't need to predict every step ahead. I only needed to be present, to honor the journey we were on. And somewhere in the midst of that, I realized something important. I wasn't searching for closure anymore. I had it. It wasn't about an ending, but a beginning that was mine to embrace. In time, I would come to understand that true healing doesn't happen in one sudden moment. It happens in the quiet, steady growth, moment by moment, choice by choice. I wasn't rushing towards some ideal future. I was living fully in the present, knowing that I was worthy of happiness, and that I was finally in a place where I could experience it. With Mia by my side, I knew that whatever came next, I was ready. And for the first time in a long time, I truly believed it.